Apreciados amigos y amigas, qué alegría que estemos todos juntos aquí en la Iglesia de Todos los Santos. Dear friends, welcome. It is such a joy for us all to be together here at All Saints Church online this morning, Sunday morning live at All Saints Church. Mi nombre es Mike Kinman. My name is Mike Kinman. Soy Rector. I am the Rector. Pronombre él. My pronouns are he, him. This is a great morning we have. We're going to start it off with a forum with Jim Newton and Governor Jerry Brown. We'll have Children's Chapel with Kelly Aaron O'Phelan at 11:15. Worship in English at Children's Chapel at 11. Worship at 11:15 in English. Worship in Spanish and English at 1. Some chances for conversation in between the two. Just hope you stick around all day. Every week we have a partner in love. There's someone in the community who is doing really amazing work that we want to support and encourage everyone to support. Our partner in love this week is an old friend. It's Learning Works Charter School. Learning Works, as you probably know, serves amazing kids who are experiencing homelessness, live in group homes, are trying to escape gang life, are pregnant and are teen parents. More than 70% of them finish with high school diplomas. And we have been supporting and will continue to support their food pantry. So you can drop off non-perishable food items, also diapers, wipes, and formula at Learning Works at 90 North Daisy. Monday through Friday from 10 to 4. Also in the link is in the chat is a link. Please make a gift to support this wonderful community. We're hoping everyone can stay home right now and be safe. We realize that some people do not have homes to stay in, and we're working on that and continue to work on that together. Also recognize home is not a safe place for everyone. And so if home is not a safe place for you, please let us know. And we're putting some other resources in the chat feature. The hotline for the National Domestic Violence hotline. The text, which is love is to 22522, and also the website to go to. Also information about the Trevor Project, their hotline, which for LGBTQ youth is an amazing resource of safety, a safe place for conversation and to connect you with resources that can help you if home is not a safe place for you. Before we get into this morning's forum, or actually as we get into this morning's forum, I invite you to just take a moment. Ground yourself. Stop whatever else you might be doing. Take a few breaths. Separate ourselves from whatever busyness may have already come before us this morning. Remember that we're in the presence of God always. And let us pray. Almighty and eternal God, so draw our hearts to you, so guide our minds, so fill our imaginations, so control our wills, that we may be wholly yours, utterly dedicated unto you. And then use us, we pray you, as you will, and always to your glory and the welfare of your people, through our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. This morning is an amazing treat and an honor. We could spend hours with either one of our guests this morning, and to pack both of them into 1 hour is going to be a challenge. First, Jim Newton. Jim spent 25 years at the Los Angeles Times as a reporter, editor, bureau chief, columnist, editor-at-large, and editor of the editorial pages. Now he's teaching at UCLA. He founded the university's Blueprint magazine. He has written best-selling biographies of Earl Warren, and that one's going on the top of my vacation reading list, and also Dwight Eisenhower. And most recently, he's turned his talents to writing this book, Man of Tomorrow, The Relentless Life of Jerry Brown, right here. There's going to be information in the chat continually about how to order this book. It is what, talk about something that should be on the top of your summer reading list. If I hadn't just finished reading it, it would be at the top of mine. Phenomenal book. And so we're so thrilled to have Jim here. And then Governor Jerry Brown. Governor Brown has quite possibly been the most influential person in California's life over the past half century. He served as both the 34th and 39th governor of California, first from 1975 to 1983, and then from 2011 to 2019. In the early 1970s, he was elected California Secretary of State, and decades later, he served as mayor of Oakland, California Attorney General. More than that, he has championed and continues to champion issues that have put California on the front of progressive movements on climate change, nuclear proliferation, and criminal justice reform. Welcome to you, Governor Brown.
Good to be here.
Great, thank you. Jim, I want to start with you. And there's a piece of the book that I want to read that I just thought captured the whole thing so well. And it's towards the end, and it starts like this. It says, "Do what you are doing, live in the inquiry." No two ideas were more associated with Jerry Brown, save perhaps for small is beautiful. He spent decades mulling them over in public and in private. He relied upon them as commands, as guides to life and governance, to focusing work and seeking out perspective. It's worth noting then that the two notions are to some degree in conflict. The first suggests serenity, humility, acceptance of one's mission, and concentration of moral energy toward its achievements. To genuinely do what one is doing argues for the infusion of work with principle and objective, whether one is crushing grapes as a young seminarian or fighting for the planet as a candidate for president. It is a serious command that binds Zen and Saint Ignatius, and it forms a moral and practical foundation for life, for a life of purpose. The latter tacks in a different direction. To live in the inquiry is not necessarily a mission of humility. It is a call to pose questions, to challenge accepted wisdom, and to dig at presumptions that seem to pass as fact. Brown refused to accept the idea that governors have legacies, for example, when everyone around him assumed it. He bristled at liberals who believe that hierarchy thwarts creativity and who reflexively respond to suffering with laws. He wrestled with the demands of punishment and mercy, questioning both. And as anyone close to Brown knows all too well, he can argue about anything. Even in the most casual encounters, Brown will challenge. Once when a visitor opened a conversation by asking, "How are you doing?" Brown launched into a critique of the question. How could he be doing anything but well, he demanded. He was alive and healthy and governor and in the thick of life. It was, he insisted, a ridiculous question. Of course, he was doing well. All of this makes me tremble as someone who is about to interview you, Governor Brown, but really I want to start with you, Jim. And say, what drew you to the governor as a subject? And more to the point, what was it like to interview someone like this and craft it into a cohesive narrative?
Well, that's at least three big questions. Let me start, if I may, just very quickly by thanking all of you who are tuned in this morning. I really appreciate it. Thanking you, of course, Governor Brown, for all your time over the last 5 years on this, and then for being here this morning. And to you, Mike and Sally, for hosting this, and to All Saints. I'm such an admirer of your determination to put faith and action together, and I appreciate it very much, and therefore especially appreciate being with you today. What drew me to the book, I grew up in California. I've been writing about politics and government my whole life. I started as a high school student in Northern California when, by the way, the governor was Jerry Brown. And I've spent a lot, as you mentioned kindly in your introduction, I spent 25 years at the paper at the Times, most of that writing about government and politics and culture, and most of that based in and talking about California. My first book, again, as you kindly mentioned, was about Earl Warren. That book came out 14 years ago, which is amazing to me. But it allowed me, Warren grew up in California and was governor for 3 terms. He was, at the time, the longest serving governor in the history of California. But he left California in 1953 to become Chief Justice of the United States. So the period of California history that I was able to cover in that book was roughly 1900 to 1950. So when I set out to do a book a few years ago, I was really interested in bringing that history to the present, covering the latter half of the 20th century, and interested in finding the right way to tell that story. And of course, the right way to tell that story is to tell it through the story of Jerry Brown. No person has been more influential in that history of California, that period of California, than Governor Brown. And so to my delight, after some conversations, he agreed to spend a lot of time with me, which again, I'm very appreciative of. And we talked for years, really, about history and philosophy and ideas. To the second half and sort of crux of your question, what was that like? Well, you're about to get a sense of that, so I don't want to interfere in it. Let me just say briefly, it was thrilling. It was humbling at times. It was challenging, and it was an absolute delight. And I am thrilled to have been able to spend this time with Governor Brown and to be able to write about it and try to put some shape around it. So it's been
Thank you. I want to kick it over to Sally Howard. It's because of Sally that all this is happening. It's Sally's friendship with Jim and his spouse that has sort of brought us together. So first of all, thank you for that, Sally. And Sally, I know you've got a question for
My
Jim.
joy. Yeah, Jim. I am wondering if you could talk about what strikes you as important about this story for the time that we're in now.
Well, I guess a lot of things. And the time that we're in now, of course, is changing as we speak. But I would start by saying that I think Governor Brown's story and approach to politics are worth a good deal of reflection. I think he brings a spiritual and intellectual dimension to his politics that is often missing or sometimes corrupted, particularly on the right. I think that his fusion of philosophical inquiry and commitment to science and intellectual rigor is the key to unlocking the climate crisis. And he, more than any elected official of our time, or maybe any time, has endeavored to do that. We are in the midst of some very acute crises right now, but they all do play out against the backdrop of a climate crisis that is ominous and upon us. And I think that Jerry Brown and his story help point to a way to address that crisis, and others as well. But to step back and to repeat myself a little, I do think that combination of intellectual rigor, spiritual inquiry, devotion to science, those are hallmarks, in my view, hallmarks of Jerry Brown's life and important to us now.
Great.
Well, and that actually kind of leads me, and I want to turn to you, Governor. And again, thank you so much for being here. Again, sort of late in the book, Jim talks about you reviewing a proposal to establish a right to die in California. And here's what you said. I have considered the theological and religious perspectives that any deliberate shortening of one's life is sinful, he wrote. I have also read the letters of those who support the bill, including heartfelt pleas from Brittany Maynard's family and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. In addition, I have discussed this matter with a Catholic bishop, two of my own doctors, and former classmates and friends who take varied, contradictory, and nuanced positions. And I was reading this, and Romans 12 came to my mind. And I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And as I was reading this book, that kept coming to me as how you lived your life. You were a lifelong Roman Catholic. You were going to be a priest at one point, and you have been shaped by many other theological and philosophical traditions. So I'd love to sort of hear your thoughts both on the idea of public service as living sacrifice. Also, how have you been transformed by the renewing of your mind? How have you been intentional about this to discern the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect?
Well, you got a lot of questions there.
Yeah.
Boy, let's see, you asked about public service and sacrifice, and then you asked how I might have been transformed by the influences that I've been had the privilege to be part of. Well, let me just say about public service. There's definitely an element of service and serving others, working for the common good, thinking about and responding to the big questions. On the other hand, a lot of what draws people to politics is the excitement, the notoriety, the glory, or the attention, the being on the field of combat not just as a sporting event, but dealing with real conflicts and issues that are very important to people. I mean, that's what politicians get to engage in. But it's a sacrifice. I did not ever encounter it as a sacrifice. Now, maybe looking back, I'll see it as a sacrifice since so much of my time was devoted to news and making statements and talking about this problem and that problem, all of which pass along, as all things in life do. And maybe I should have spent more time, with family and reflection and with friends. So, but if you want to just say, is public service a sacrifice? The answer is no. Public service is fun. Public service is exciting, and it can be important. But from the politicians that I meet, people are drawn to it. It's like, why does someone become a minister or a movie actor or a carpenter or a lawyer or a doctor? You're drawn to it often by what your parents did, your significant others in your life. My father was a politician all the time I was growing up. He ran for, the first time I remember him running for office was 1943 when I was 5 and in kindergarten. And I went to the swearing in January of 1944 at the San Francisco City Hall when he was sworn in as the district attorney of San Francisco. So it's not unusual for me to follow in that path after a detour of going to the seminary. But I can't emphasize enough the vitality, the excitement that is there, along with the importance. And I don't know that you could say that politicians are characterized by either their humility or by their lack of ego. It's my experience that politicians like attention, they like to be where the action is, and they need that kind of reinforcement. So I don't want to overstate it. And if I may inject a little of my modest theological understanding.
Please.
All roles are important. All aspects of the mystical body contribute to the whole. And so, yes, there's governors, but there's all the other roles. And people choose governor, not choose politician, assemblyman, mayor, city council person, whatever that may be, often in the same way you choose anything else, because the influences that were brought to bear in your life make it plausible. Okay, so that's the story about service and not much sacrifice, I would say. And by the way, all this thing about sacrificing your family and this and that. My father, I've read his biography. I think he ran for 10 offices at Lowell High School. Never made student body president, but he was head of this club and that club. And he got off to an early start. So he was running. He liked to run for office. He liked solving these problems, and he liked to be in the action. So that's what he did. Did that sacrifice? Did he have time to go to a lot of my events? No, but people didn't do that. And I'm just as glad he didn't. When I grew up, in the 50s, parents didn't go to the debate tournaments or the games or school. I would have been embarrassed. But he did what he did. And that was, as it turns out, was quite a model. It was a pathway that I didn't have to think about, but was available when I left the seminary, went to Berkeley, went to Yale Law School, came back, and this was something I just fell into very naturally, although I had to make a lot of decisions. Now, the other question, what was the other question?
That's okay. This is great. So it was about you started out going to seminary,
yeah,
and you were deeply rooted and have been in Catholic theology, yeah, and you have drawn from so many other pieces. Yes. Talk about like the intentionality of that in your life, and how has that all come together and shaped you?
All right. Hard to say how it shaped me, but I would say what I would think is that I was fairly serious. I'd say more serious than most about Mass. I was an altar boy, and I went to Catholic schools and that kind of thing. So I did have a sense of a certain emptiness about much of life, about particularly materialism. And in 1955, that was when I was at Santa Clara, 55, 56. I remember a classmate of mine, Tom Brady, I don't know, we were walking down the hall or maybe sitting somewhere in Santa Clara. He said, it's too bad. All the big problems have been solved. There's not much left to do. So things were rather placid. Eisenhower was president. We weren't in any wars. And there was a certain complacency, leave it to Beaver was kind of the model of the home. And all these conflicts to come hadn't happened yet. The Vietnam War, the civil rights activism, much less the women's movement, LGBT, all that came many decades later. So in my mind, the material world seemed a bit empty, and the religion, spirituality seemed to hold the promise of a deeper meaning. And so I went to visit, and of course, for me, spirituality was connected with the Jesuits because I was in my 5th year of Jesuit schooling. So I went to the Los Gatos Novitiate, which was the training place in Los Gatos, just 15 miles from Santa Clara. And I liked that. I was drawn to it. It was a life, it seemed quiet, it seemed reflective. And if there was ever a path to access the deeper sense or understanding of life, this seemed to be it. So it was really more in the nature of a quest for meaning in an otherwise, I don't want to say just pedestrian life. I had a lot of fun at Santa Clara. We did lots of things, certain amount of drinking, dances, all the normal stuff. But it seemed at some level not satisfying. So that's why I went in pursuit of this other realm. And then, of course, I left that because I felt that I had my issues, the whole, and by the way, not only did I leave, but as it turned out, 90% of the other people eventually left. And the whole way of life, Latin, silence, the whole way we used to think of things, eternal damnation, all the different, that a lot of that is passed away, and the church has evolved and changed and still is changing. So that all changed. So anyway, I left what was a bubble of what I'd call pre-Vatican II Catholicism. And I left that, and I went to Berkeley. I wanted the exact opposite pole. So I had the experience of isolation. We never were not allowed any press. We had no radio, no newspapers, no magazines, only basically the New Testament, Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, and the lives of Jesuit saints, and treatises on ascetical spirituality. So that's what it was. And so I got that. At least I got as much as I wanted. And I went to Berkeley, totally different, kind of a free, this is the beginning of this is again in the shadow of the beatnik movement, which I didn't know that much about, but I knew something about it. And so it was a very open, exciting world, but lacking that central focus that I had in the seminary. Right. So then I was going to become a psychiatrist because, okay, if I'm not going to go cure and save souls, I'll deal with psyches. That's the next thing. It seemed like it. Wow. So I started I'm going to become a psychiatrist. Read a lot of books on that. I was very excited about it. Well, I took my first class, you have to be a doctor. So I took my first class in chemistry and physics. After 2 weeks said, nope, I'm not doing that. So then I went and said, I'll be a psychologist. That's easier. No, okay, but then I did that. And I thought, now that's a little crazy, that whole psychology world. So I said, okay, I'll just go to law school, which I did. And then through going to law school and coming back, my father was governor. I said, okay, this looks exciting. I'm going to become governor. And I decided that. At the very, I know the exact spot at the governor's mansion, listening to my father talk with the speaker of the assembly. I said, this is really exciting stuff. So that's what I did. And eventually I moved to LA because that's where the media market is. That's where the money is. That's where, at that point, greater political power resided. So I did that, ran for the junior college board, then ran for Secretary of State, and got elected governor at the age of 36. Now, along the way, I visited the Trappist monastery in Northern California. I visited Tassajara. I had an interest in Zen Buddhism as well as other spiritual paths. But I'm certainly very much embedded in this pursuit of politics. And you don't run for governor, what is it? I ran for Secretary of State 4 years after my father was defeated by Reagan. You don't get there if you think about too many other things. So I thought about fundraising, getting my name in the paper, getting out there and making all the alliances with all the interest groups. So don't have any misunderstanding. I was a thorough politician to the core, and I did okay at it because I focused on it. Now, I've always had other interests, and those other interests are written about in the book. And I would say, just hitting a couple of the themes: diversity, the bringing in of women and minorities. In fact, the first gay judge in Regents, which is pretty path-breaking back in the late 70s. And then climate change or the environment, those kind of things. And then, of course, criminal justice reform, which has been a real interest to me. So all of that is connected both with my spiritual formation and, I would say, my political formation and the life that I've led.
That's wonderful. I want to get back to climate change and criminal justice reform in just a little bit. Sally, I want to kick it over to you. I know you've got something.
Yeah, just following up on that, Governor Brown, I think I mentioned this in our kind of preliminary meeting the other day, but I was so struck by, what I read as when you were first elected, your appointment and delegation to a large number or select number of people, and then going on retreat for contemplation. And I also noticed, when you were, returning to clemency and pardons, that you also read a lot of outside, I think Foucault at that point, Wittgenstein earlier. And I think, Jim, you described it as the sanctum of the governor's mansion that you very thoughtfully, and it seemed to me contemplatively, thought about what to do with justice in that particular circumstance. So anyway, I would love to hear your own sense of contemplation in an ongoing way in your life, and am I reading it accurately to your experience? But the role of contemplation and mindfulness and in your life as a politician.
Well, I would say, just to say, one thing I was interested at that time was also Sufism, and there was a group called the Sufi Choir. And I had if I recall right, I think I had the Sufi Choir at my victory party at the Los Angeles Convention Center. And then we had a big yellow sign, printed very large letters on the wall, said Age Quod Agis, which in Latin means do what you're doing, which was kind of a motto at that time in the Jesuit seminary. But I like the Sufis. In fact, I went to one of the Sufi dances, and actually there's a cosmic mass that Inyat Khan did in Berkeley that I went to later. But the joy, the joy of that practice was very impressive. It's not Jesuit contemplation by any means, but it did have a very joyful and a community kind of expression there. And I always thought the Sufi stories were very interesting, like the Zen stories. Now, if you're asking me about contemplation, the motto, one of the ideals of the Jesuits are to be a contemplative in action. Now, that's easier said than done because they are contradictory. And I would say, while I've gone to monasteries, I went to Japan. I spent 6 months in Japan, as a matter of fact, and we had meditation every day from the Zen tradition. But that's Japan. Going to the Trappist, that's going to the Trappist. Or going to Tassajara, that's the Zen Buddhist. But then you get back to action. You got to deal with the legislature. You got to answer reporters' questions. You got to raise money from rich people, from labor unions, from property developers, from oil companies, from you name it. So how the two fit together, I'd say that's still a matter of inquiry. And I can say that when you're in the hustle of campaigning and active politics, it doesn't sound very contemplative to me. I'm sure an evolved mind could link the two together more than I ever did, but I would have to say they tend to be more separate than probably the ideal would be. And I think it is even hard for Jesuits. It's one thing to go to a monastery where you chant the hours, the Psalms, Get up in the middle of the
Yes.
night, you do it 6 times a day. That's one thing. But when you get out running around raising money, talking about this, talking about that, making deals, trying to make compromises, that level of frenetic activity is a life all its own, and it has a buzz and an attraction that I would say is inconsistent with quiet, contemplative presence. So I leave it as for inquiry rather than
Yes.
definitive description.
Jim, I'd love to kick
Thank you.
it over to you and say, like, what have you noticed in the time you spent with the governor about sort of how he's integrating all these things into his life? What's your perspective on this?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to tell the governor how his life is integrated.
Good point.
But I would say this. I think there are 2 areas, and you've mentioned both of them, in which I would argue, Governor, tell me that I'm wrong here, it wouldn't be the first time, that they come together. And I see it in you, Governor, in climate change, and in a sense of the humility that is enforced by contemplating the real laws of nature, and the place that humanity has within that contemplation. One of my favorite quotes of Governor Brown's is when President Trump was withdrawing or attempting to withdraw from the Paris Accords and seeming to treat climate change lightly. Governor Brown noted that he seemed to lack a sufficient fear of God.
Yes.
Fear of the Lord, I think, is what
Of the Lord.
Yes, he did.
Thank you for
Yes, he
correcting me.
did.
I think that underscores
Absolutely.
a contemplative and also a philosophical context in which climate change is important. And then the other, and again, the governor can address this better than I can for sure, but would be in the area of criminal justice and mercy and how to balance imperatives like safety and mercy. And so in those areas, while I certainly wouldn't disagree that fundraising and polling and stumping and even some of the mechanics of climate change, cap and trade proposals or bills in the legislature, those may not be places of contemplation, but underlying those ideas and interests and commitments, I do think is a deeper well of contemplation.
Well, and so like, I'd love to let's talk about climate change, because Governor, what you did in terms of climate change in California is formidable. You put us on track to make the state carbon neutral by 2045 and 5 million plug-in electric cars on the roads by 2030, and you extended cap and trade to 2030, and you helped found the Under 2 coalition. And yet what we're faced with is this impulse in our life to only see what's right in front of us, to not have the long view, to just care about the next quarterly stock report, the next election, but not the next generation. You said in the book, can the community propound a value separate and apart from markets? And it felt like frustration, when you said that, but also a challenge. And so can you talk a little about your dedication to climate change, and also how do we move the needle on this when it is so clear that right now we're moving in the opposite direction?
Well, first I do want to frame climate change and the environment in the theological realm. Living in this ephemeral world, I'm being very aware of that, how things are passing and nothing is really eternal or permanent. And that's what drew me to what I thought would be a much more grounded life in the Jesuit seminary. The environment, the rules of nature, that's something that we have to adjust to. We don't adjust them. So the environment struck me as an analog to the theological principles. These are absolutes. My father always said there's a moral absolute. Okay, well, whatever that might be, there's a moral absolute. There's an absolute in that so much carbon is going to produce so much heat, is going to produce so much change and negative change. So that's what got me interested, particularly in the environment. And one of the persons I spent a fair amount of time with, Gregory Bateson, who was had a real influence in the 70s. But one thing he said, he liked to quote, I think it's St. Paul to the Galatians, God is not mocked. And he used that to say the ecology is not mocked. If you abuse the ecology, you abuse it at your expense, is what we're doing. With 8 billion people on the planet, 1 billion cars, massive fossil fuel, greenhouse gases rising at increasing level. Okay, that is, we got to turn around. Now, California, we definitely led the way. As nowhere in the Western Hemisphere did as much as California. That's true. And we did it because we had a tradition that way. We had the Coastal Commission. Arnold Schwarzenegger pushed these global warming ideas as counter ideas, I would say. So did Gray Davis, and even Ronald Reagan signed as governor, the Air Resources Board, the Environmental Quality Act, a number of things. So I was able to show up in a tradition that was quite viable. In fact, we had the Air Resources Board, which is the most powerful expert body of government to dealing with climate change, even more so than the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. So we had the mechanics, the institution, the knowledge, the people to carry on, and then I took it further. Okay, so having said all that, we're not on the path. California, yeah, I said, sign an executive order, a piece of paper, that's all it is. We're going to get to carbon neutrality by 2045. Wait a minute, we can't get there without massive reduction in carbon emissions, and we can't get there without negative emissions, which means carbon sequestration, which we have no economical means to do at any scale. So we need massive technology breakthroughs, and we need massive social and political change, and we need it at the national, international level, and we're not getting it. China's doing better in many ways than we are, but they're building a lot more coal plants, and they're sponsoring the carbon intense projects through the Belt and Road Project. In America, we have a president who's rescinded 50 different environmental rules that Obama put in, pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and a lot of other nations, whether it's India or Brazil or Russia, we're not on track. So California, yes, we have we have an edge here, but relative to the challenge, it's relatively small. I was almost going to use the word trivial. I don't want to say that, maybe too negative. But as much as we're doing, we have to do so much more, and we can't do it unless others do it too. Because a molecule of CO2 in Beijing, Moscow, or Milpitas, or Pasadena, it's all the same. So we're all in it together. So that's the beauty and maybe the horror of the climate threat, is that it's only something that will be solved by everyone together in solidarity doing what they need to, starting first with the president and the Congress of the United States, almost and equally as important, if not more so, China, and whatever the issues on China, China is a key to reducing carbon emissions. And America must work very closely with China. Whatever all these other political things that are very, very important to lots of people and to the world. However, the climate is changing. The outcome is going to be a horror. We talk about tens of thousands of refugees on the border, and that gets a lot of people excited. We're going to have tens of millions of climate refugees. I mean, the whole world, look at what Syria, 5 or 6 million people moving around out of that conflict. Climate, you're going to have hundreds of millions and massive suffering visited upon some in Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, far worse. So the inequalities are all going to be magnified as they are here with the virus as well. So we have an imperative to deal with this and deal with inequity at the same time. And we're not even close. We're not even in preschool in the course that we must embark upon if we're going to slow this down. So the question is, will the obvious peril of climate show up soon enough, but still be resolvable, so that by the time we really see and feel climate, so we're going to ready to do something, we being the world and the leaders and all the rest of them aren't doing anything right now, or by the time that happens in 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, will it be so irreversible that we'll be in such a big hole that we're going to have to dig out. Well, I don't know if we can dig out of it. It may not. And that's the problem when people say, oh, going to non-renewable energy, going to non-polluting cars, changing all these different things, it's too expensive. It is a fraction of the cost of what we're going to have to pay for under a hotter climate, more pandemics because of the movement of tropical vectors up here, and lower productivity in food supply, illnesses. Man, it is so horrible. And people know that. But because of the news of the day, and I'm not saying the activities in the news of today aren't important, but relative to the global horror that we are headed toward, they are small. So we, yes, deal with today's, but we can't neglect. And to wake ourselves up in the midst of news of the day is almost impossible. So climate is barely a talking point. And I just have to interject. At the same time, we're building, U.S. government, Congress, voting billions for more nuclear weapons. And we already have thousands, and they're on alert, controlled by software that is shown to be defective in the past. So that risk is mounting, and it's virtually unmentioned. So, I could go and give you 5 things, but I would say it's time to wake up, folks, whether you're in Pasadena or anywhere else, because we are in deep darknhave
Well, and I want
Amen.
to, and I want to connect those two things.
What?
Yeah, I'd love to connect those two things because you have a friendship with William Perry, the Secretary of Defense under Clinton, and have talked a lot about nuclear proliferation. And William Perry says the danger of nuclear war is greater now than it was in the Cold War. And you talk about two things that seem to connect climate change and the nuclear issue, which is complacency and routine. And you said in the book, false optimism and the reliance of hope over analysis lead to profound despair and tragedy. So can you actually talk a little bit more, because these things that aren't right in front of our face all the time are huge. So can you talk a little more about the nuclear danger that you see right now? And then also I want to say, how hopeful are you about all this? Where is hope?
Where is hope? That is a good question. I'm very enthused about talking with you and doing whatever I can as to what the risk or what are the probabilities. Look, they're serious enough that there's no room for any complacency. I like to, what was helpful for me in waking up to the extent that I am moderately awake, and I'm sure we're all mostly asleep. That's what Gurdjieff would say, if you want to go back to that way of spiritual formation, that we're sleepy and we're mechanical and we need some shocks personally to get off it. Anyway, there we are. But on the nuclear, what helped me, and climate as well, I read this book on the First World War by a man named Clark, and he talked about sleepwalking. And there, in that 1914, we had all these nice Christians, the Orthodox Russian, the Anglican Catholic, the king over there in England, the French, the Germans, they're cousins and they're Christians and they're well educated, and they march right into folly, an absurd war that we're still paying for in the Middle East because of what the consequences were after World War I. So you can be asleep. And how do you wake up? Because we're like that now. We're pre-disaster. And so I think that is the challenge. And intellectuals, politicians, artists, clergy, and the clergy, I think, have a big role here, particularly the evangelical clergy. The red states are not paying attention, just like they don't like to wear masks. They don't like to think climate change is a problem. And they're certainly not worried about nuclear bombs going off. So there's a lot of work here. I think there's enough room for missionary activity that you can work every day between now and the day you die, and you will be doing work that is well needed.
Well, and so like you also drew a connection that someone just drew in the Q&A about the discord on the current pandemic is rooted in the same denial.
Yes.
Of denial of climate change as its own pandemic.
Yeah, the pandemic is a very instructive example. So what happened? You got a few cases. The scientists tell us, hey, you only got a few, but it's community spread and you got to stop it. Now, and we could, and there was no national leadership. Everybody was slow. And quite frankly, which is, I got to inject this point. Why is it that the United States of America that could build Liberty ships in a matter of days can't make the protective equipment that is needed at the scale required, and it can't make the test kits, not even close. And China already has an excess capacity. They can make millions of test kits in a day. And of course, we're not buying from them because they're on the sanction list. But why can't America, that made Liberty ships, can't? Well, one thing, the president is not calling for it, but I think that's a matter that we might reflect on, we live with a little bit. We couldn't do the testing. Well, if you can't do the testing and you don't have a vaccine, then you're just going to spread this disease unless you lock everybody up. If you lock everybody up, we're in depression. And that is disproportionately visited upon those with the least income. So the only way forward is to test and quarantine and then open the economy. Well, we're not testing it. We're testing a lot, not at the levels. You got to quarantine. You got to have a place. By the way, if you're going to quarantine people, you got to do what Taiwan did. You got to pay them money. So if we're going to do this thing right, we can't expect the poor people to be doing all the essential work and getting all the diseases and coming home with their family. They can't quarantine at home because they got several kids and they'll spread it. So we got to have the facilities, the hotels, the motels, and we got to pay people. And that takes government, and that takes political will, of which we have almost zero at this moment in time, relative to the COVID challenge, relative to the climate challenge, and relative to the nuclear challenge. I would even go one more, relative to the criminal justice challenge.
Right,
So,
and I want to get to that piece, yeah.
All that stuff, I'm glad we're here in church because we better do some heavy praying.
We do, and the prayer's got to come to action. Jim, go ahead.
I'm going to say a very quick thing, which is you asked me at the outset, what is it like to try to work on a book about Jerry Brown? That's what it's like.
That's great.
All of that.
Well, and I want to go back to political will, because what you really pointed out so clearly is this is not an issue of capacity for any of these things. We have the capacity to deal with climate change. We need technological innovation, but we have the capacity to generate that. We have the capacity to deal with nuclear proliferation. We have the capacity to deal with pandemics. We do not have the political will. So how do we work together to generate the political will? In other words, in many ways, how do we take our democracy back?
Well, one thing I'd like to do, I want to emphasize, because it's one concrete. Why can't the United States of America do millions of tests every day and quarantine the people who test positive, and then in 2 weeks they can go back to their business and open the whole economy full blast? We're not doing that. It's so, they open, they close, they this, they that. This takes the president and the Congress. Hey, we declare the emergency. We're spending the money. We can go from cars to tanks in a matter of days and hours. We got to do the same thing here. Then if we can learn to do that with the pandemic, then we can learn to do that with the climate change. Arms will be more difficult. The criminal justice, the police rules, and all that. Boy, there's plenty to do here. I'm glad you meet every Sunday, because this is it's a weekly challenge.
Well, and what you're getting to is a crisis can show us what our capacity is if we have the will to deal with the crisis. And then we can turn that capacity to dealing with the chronic, the larger issues. But we're not even taking this crisis and using it as the opportunity to deal with, with what's in front of us.
Okay, here's a perfect example I'm sorry I'm not giving you some positives, but maybe we see the negatives where we can avoid them.
That's right.
What do we do? What is the essence of this pandemic? Is it that it came from China? No. The essence is that this little virus, it spreads all over the damn world. 8 million people have been tested positive. I think it's 8 million. So it's mutually, we are all mutually vulnerable, whether we live in Beijing, Pasadena, or Moscow. So this should be the great occasion to sense our planetary vulnerability and solidarity and unity. But instead, what do? We hear, oh, it's China's fault, or it's this, or it's that. No, this is the time for collaboration. And thank God, the scientists are collaborating. Whether anybody knows it or not, scientists in China are working with scientists in Europe and America quietly to try to come up with a vaccine. But this is the challenge, that we can develop our social muscles to work on common problems. But so far, there's been a major default to nationalism, which is really egotism writ large. And we got to break through that and not tolerate, oh, let's blame this one, let's blame China. No, China's got plenty of faults. By the way, America's got plenty of faults. Just look at the last couple of months. There are a lot of people that are saying, look at all these problems. So we all got problems. Why don't we deal with our problems in some way that we're all in it together? That's the number one issue. We're in it together, black and white, male and female, Chinese and American. And if we could use the issue of the pandemic to get there. But so far, the pandemic has just been absorbed into the national egotism. My dog is better than your dog. My vaccine is going to be better selling than your vaccine. Well, I think we got plenty of work just on the virus to wake up and get on the path of a more enlightened solidarity.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you so much, and amen. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to touch on one other thing that you talked about, which is criminal justice reform. And so much of public policy in the last half century has been shaped by politics and by needing to show you're tough on crime and by some really faulty assumptions. Your approach to criminal justice reform was shaped by Michel Foucault and looking at incarceration and the role of the state. Can you talk a little about the philosophy that has shaped the way you approach this that is so different? And then also talk about you mentioned before we were doing our pre-interview, the ballot initiative, the California Criminal Sentencing, Parole, and DNA Collection Initiative that's coming up on the ballot, and talk about why we need to shoot that thing down.
Okay, I would minimize Foucault.
Okay.
We want to talk about, let's just, the key phrase in the Our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Okay, does that apply to robbers, murderers, rapists, burglars?
Yeah.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Where does forgiveness fit in? Where does repentance fit in? And what is proper penance? Or what is punishment? Is punishment being put in a cage for a week, for a month, for a year, for a life? Does, once you commit the crime and are convicted, does the clock stop? Is any further amendment of your life or change or transformation, does that count? Is there room for any enlightenment, or lock up, the key away, you're a loser, stay a loser? Well, one practical problem, just take the lowest first, is that makes prisons very dangerous because there is no hope. That's a zero hope path. And we have 5,000 people in California prison who have no, at this point, unless the governor pardons them, they have no chance, or commutes, they have no chance to get out. Their life without parole. Now, most of them did some very heinous things. But I will tell you, in 1970, there was, I don't think anybody in California prisons, of which there were a third of what we have today, life without parole. Everybody was eligible. Almost 98% were eligible to at least have a hearing and be judged on their rehabilitation or their repentance or their transformation. So that, I say, just get back to allowing a parole hearing. But instead of doing that, the Los Angeles Protective League, the Los Angeles Deputy District Attorneys, the Los Angeles Deputy Sheriffs linked up with others, Safeway and Ralph's, and they have paid money to put an initiative on the ballot to take away even parole opportunities we have today. And by a clever manipulation of some text, they are going to take away not parole, but the very opportunity to be judged by a parole board. They want to take that away. And that's this proposition of so-called Cooper Initiative, which is meant to gut and repeal a significant part of the reforms that were part of the ballot measure that I was able to sponsor and pass just a few years ago. So we are facing in the November election an opportunity to reject this very, I would say, if I'm without being too, whatever you, maybe I can't say it that way, I don't have a Roman color on me anymore, but it seems very un-Christian.
Amen. I'll join you.
Amen.
The opportunity for repentance. Now, some people never get it, but I can tell you thousands of people get it. Most of these murderers get out, most of them. And other people, and they do some people do horrible things, and time passes, and their wife dies, their mother dies, so they get knifed in prison, they see killings, and they wake up. There is an awakening. You know, St. Paul was persecuting the Christians. His name was Saul, and all of a sudden he got thrown off his horse. There are thousands of inmates that are thrown off their horse, as it were, all the time in the prisons of America. But the law in many states does not recognize that. And the law in California in many respects doesn't. And I think that we need a much more diverse and enlightened form of criminal justice. Yes, and we ought to really think, what is punishment all about? And with a little bit of humility, instead of the self-righteousness, I'm all good. That's why I think somewhere St. Paul talks about working out your salvation in fear and trembling. You don't know when you're going to do something or something horrible is going to occur with your help and all that. So we need humility, which doesn't exist in most of these movements. But we need, I think you can really help in that sense. First, defeat that Cooper initiative. We don't have the number yet, but you'll be able to tell your parishioners, and we'll be advertising on that. So that's a step, but only a step. We have to have reentry programs. We need a lot more.
Yes.
We're gonna, I mean, we could talk about social justice from schools to police to prisons and all the rest of it. A lot of room, a lot of good things going on, but a lot more good things could happen.
Well, and you got personally involved in this to an extent that almost no governor, maybe no governor ever has. During your 2 terms, you issued 1,736 pardons, 284 commutations. And it's because you knew the difference that this could make. And we want to bring someone on right now, Raul Zarate. Raul was one of the people that you gave a second chance to when you commuted his sentence. And Raul, I know you're on here. There you are. I just want to bring you on. Just, a little chance to sort of maybe say hi to the governor, tell your story, and just talk about what you've done with your second chance.
Oh, definitely. First, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to join, and thanking Governor Jerry Brown for even being here to be part of this is huge. For me, I think Governor Jerry Brown hit it right on the nail. There's a lot of people that are incarcerated as of today, and they're doing great things, and I know they can do great things out here. I'm a prime example of one of that. I was supposed to be getting out 2023, and thanks to Governor Jerry Brown, I'm out here living and helping the community, the young ones. I work for a charter school in Pasadena called Learning Works Charter School, working with junior high school kids who are at risk, going through the same struggles I was going through: hopelessness, gang involvement, things like that, drug addiction, whatever the case may be. They need somebody there that can help them and guide them and transition them to a better way of life. And I think that me being there is an awesome opportunity, and that's on behalf of all the kids. I think they're very thankful that I'm in a position where I'm at today, where I can actually guide them and show them a different way of life. And they actually see, right? They actually see. I just graduated from Cal State LA with my BA with honors, magna cum laude. So thank you, Governor Jerry Brown, for that. I would have still been in prison, now stagnant. I did earn my AA degrees in prison, but I was capped at a certain point. There was no way I can go for a higher education. And so coming out here, it was a perfect time for me to get involved not only with the community, but pursue a higher education as well, and try to change those social problems, social issues that we have in society. But I think, though, like Governor Jerry Brown said, we have to, forgive people and see that the transformation, the people do change. And honestly, my story is, I think the month before my sentence was commuted, I was up for transfer. And I had level 1 points, but I couldn't go to a level 1 because I was considered a violent offender. And it just hurt that I couldn't go to a fire camp, because I really wanted to go to a fire camp and help out, any way that I could, just make amends, for the wrongs I've done, and it really hurt me not being able to go. And then a month later, Governor Jerry Brown commutes my sentence, and so now I'm out in society helping out kids, on a level 0, right, instead of a level 1, right? So I really do think there's a lot of change that we could be doing. Especially for those who are system impacted, people do change, but it takes having these dialogues, right? That just because, you're labeled, that doesn't really define you. You have to see the work that people are doing and how we can work together. I work with Mike Kinman's son and working with kids, right? And it's just an awesome opportunity where I'm able to be in that position to be able to help out, right? Work with a variety of different people. We're in the same mission. But I really, thank Governor Jerry Brown for actually, taking the initiative, right? Taking the initiative to believe in people and say, you know what, let me give this person an opportunity. He's worked hard, and I worked very hard. I was facilitating classes.
Yes, you did.
I was running programs, helping the youth offenders that were coming in, a variety of different things. And so now being out here, I can channel that to preventative measures, right? Before the kids get into any issues or problems or even get into gangs. So before that, I can guide them into, the proper way of going through education or, whatever the career they want to get into, or vocational or jobs, just the help that they need. So we're doing great in this community. Pasadena has been lovely to me. There has been a lot of support. I have All Saints, United Methodist. So churches have been awesome. I really appreciate it, but there's a stigma that comes with this, right? That you were formerly incarcerated. And so getting over that barrier, right? It's Raul. You don't no longer look at him as a formerly incarcerated felon, but you look at him as Raul. Yeah. And you're able to work with them and working together for the same cause, right? We're in the same team, and just looking at me as I'm part of the same team makes a difference.
Raul, thank you so much, Governor. I want to give you a chance to sort of say anything to Raul and also have a last word, and then I'll kick it to Jim.
No, sounds great. Glad you're on the right path, and glad we had the community college learning that was in the prisons. We got to really expand that. But at work, you're a good example of that, and great. What can I say?
I definitely appreciate it. Hopefully Calusa's doing great. I was going to send you a letter when you were still in office. And just with a few kids, thanking you as well, but I didn't really have the opportunity. So jumping on here and thanking you and just giving you an update of, how I'm doing, I think it's an opportunity for me that I'm blessed to have, and hopefully give Calusa a big hug for me.
Will do. She's right here.
Good.
I love that dog.
Thank you. Thank you. Governor, thank you so much, Raul, and we're all so proud of you, and just keep it up, and All Saints is with you all the way. Governor, any last words for us?
No, just let's try to wake up in whatever way we are asleep. And there's many ways of doing that every day, in the concrete as well as these big global issues.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Jim,
well said.
Any last words for us? Any sort of final wrap-up
I just want to say thank you all. Congratulations, Raul, and good luck. Thank you, Governor, for all you've done and keep doing, and to All Saints for your great work. Thank you.
Well, and we'd love to have each of you back individually to continue this conversation in different ways. In the meantime, we have to jump off to Children's Chapel with Kelly Aaron O'Phelan. Jim Newton, Governor Brown, thank you so much, not just for your time this morning, but for your work for truth, which is what we're all searching for and what we all strive to be about. Yes. Thank you all. God bless you all.